Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
As always, glad to be here.
Welcome once again. Several big topics again today, and the big topic itself is very closer to home: India and Pakistan, deepening India-Pakistan crisis. How would you look at it? Is it why does Pakistan and terrorism seem to be going hand in hand? How do we want to look at it? Where do we go from here? Is it over or is it going to go beyond this?
Well, the latest events that India struck 9 sites in Pakistan, losing apparently 2 jets. There were some civilians killed as well as militant personnel. Indicates that there is a fairly serious infrastructure supporting these networks that's beyond random terrorist groups in Kashmir. We're seeing that there's a supportive network. In Pakistan, there's nothing new because we're seeing a lot of similarities between the Kashmir attack and the Mumbai attack in 2008. And the same terrorists were involved, and those terrorists also had handlers back in Pakistan, as we now know. And one of the main witnesses who can provide and shed light on this Pakistani network has been transported after the agreement with the Trump administration back to India, and will likely provide a lot of insight on the continuity in those operations. Now, from 2008 to 2025 is a long time. Are these exactly the same individuals? Maybe not. But what's more important is that infrastructure is the same. There's been several changes in Pakistani government since then, and yet none of them have unraveled this underlying policy of supporting terrorists against India, which indicates that despite fractures inside the government, despite the fact that there are factions inside the military and intelligence and different parties with different allegiances and different foreign influences, the intelligence networks under the surface of politics are the ones really running the show. And their policy has not changed. Unlike the various corruption-ridden prime ministers that come and go, these people remain the same. They are the real power, and they are the ones that are charged with the security network, and they are the ones playing both sides with the Taliban, with various terrorist organizations, not just LET. So what is their interest? Their interest is in perpetuating power for the sake of power. Their interest is in money. If they're paid sufficiently, they will even act against their national interest. And it's not in Pakistan's national interest to be in a state of perpetual war and not to be able to recover its economy. Let's remember that the country is already $20 billion in debt to China alone, aside from other issues. And constant terrorism and fighting undermines economic projects, whether Chinese, the Gulf states, or anybody else. Nobody wants to invest money in a place that is ridden with terrorist groups that attack even their own founders. So we are seeing that there's a very ingrained, deep-seated problem that no faction, no political party, and no prime minister has been able to deal with. Even if they wanted to, they do not have the control, and they eventually come and go, usually due corruption or political infighting, and these shadow governing structures remain the same. And until those structures are dismantled, until there is a very transparent process, an independent commission set up with reviewing and disempowering and disarming and completely restructuring everything from scratch, meaning rebuilding the entire intelligence infrastructure on a modern day uh, uh, structure, and not the way it was in 1947 it was created, and until now, until it's filled with completely different people trained completely different way, until the military lets go of the control of the economy and there's an opportunity for people to push for national interest and not just a crony network nepotistic interest. I don't see anything changing.
Absolutely. But do you think this time Pakistan or those interests have bitten much more than they could chew? Because it's a different administration here in India, different government, and Mr. Prime Minister Modi is a very determined man. How would you like to assess it from that point of view?
Let me put it this way. The strikes that we have seen are very similar to the strikes that took place in 2019, and they were highly effective in that they put an end to this sort of provocations for quite a while, for several years. But did they completely stop them? No, because terrorism is not stopping. And furthermore, there are, there was, because of this, precisely because of this limited effectiveness, there was a sense of complacency, which I think made people forget a little that this problem is permanent because of the nature of the extremists lodged in there. Furthermore, there are external factors outside outside the control of India, or for that matter, even Pakistan, which have taken place since then. And I'm talking about the situation in Bangladesh, which feeds a network of external extremists and creates networks that are far more powerful than what they have been on their own. We are also seeing for the first time evidence of Middle Eastern groups aligning directly, not just ideologically, in the planning of this terrorist attack, which makes it different from anything else that happened up until this point. And I'm talking about Hamas. The fact that these groups were planning this attack for at least a year, similar to what happened in October 7th, that they met at conferences, different events with Hamas operatives, that they shared methods and best practices, so to speak, means that they've also become more sophisticated, and they've learned how to avoid, and they've learned from the lessons from previous attacks, both in India and in Israel, which means they're more powerful together, and they're looking to outsmart the intelligence agencies that are also cooperating, just like Indian, Israeli intelligence, and the US intelligence, of course, are cooperating. These groups understand all of that, and they're looking to circumvent it through more sophisticated operations. So it's not just the political will to respond, which is, of course, important. It's also about the fact that these structures are now becoming more ingrained, more sophisticated, more integrated with other groups around the world. So the problem is becoming truly global and beyond the limitations and confines of territorial structures. This is becoming a transnational problem that's much harder to fight.
Absolutely. So, what does Pakistan gain out of it? Its economy is in not so great shape, and it cannot, it will be difficult for it to take this beyond what it is happening. They can only speak. They may have friends, a few friends left here and there, but I want to understand there is always, the people who are also watching there in Pakistan. There we keep on seeing things that, they would also want a better quality of life rather than getting into things which has been, not so good for anyone. How would you like to tell? Do you think, Pakistan is going towards a much more bigger problem and by creating this problem?
Look, Pakistan as a country is getting absolutely nothing about it, and it's quite right. The people there are not going to be any better off, whether from any limited action or from a full scale war. Neither outcome is going to benefit the people of Pakistan. But we're not talking about the people of Pakistan who made this choice. We're talking about specific functionaries who decided to distract from their own internal problems to divert attention by a provocative action, knowing the risk that they were undertaking, because India has become significantly more sophisticated even from 6 years ago, thanks to continuing training with US and other forces, improved technology, the development of its own defense industry, and better geopolitical positioning and understanding, and a much improved economy. All of these factors lifted India in a much better direction and made it in a better position to respond effectively to that sort of activity. Not to say that there aren't any problems, and that India is also at a risk in case of a full front war. It would be very expensive. It would not be a good thing for it at this stage. But what I am saying is that whoever was doing that was not thinking about national interest, just like Hamas was not thinking about the interest of its people. Quite the opposite. Hamas, when it launched the attack against Israel, was thinking about how to distract from its own mismanagement and economic problems. Because guess what? A few months before the attack, there were massive protests in Gaza against Hamas on the basis of economy, not on the basis of Israel. There was a lot of support for the attack, which is why they did it, but on the basis of governance, poor governance. And we are seeing something similar. The mindset is similar. Why did they think that they would do any better against India than Hamas did against Israel? Probably because they looked at the mistakes that Israel has done in response. And they were thinking, assessing their relative complacency. They thought that maybe India is going to make the same mistake in responding. It's going to scramble, it's going to be slow, it's not going to be able to figure out what to do, and it's going to be indecisive in a long-term plan. And let's remember, there's the terrorist groups who carried out the attacks, and then there is Pakistan, the country. And unlike Hamas, it is a country. It's a government. So they knew that the risk would also be higher for the Indian government, and so they were also counting on that. That they were counting that India would try to control the escalation to keep from being dragged into a big war, and so they were willing to take that risk to test vulnerabilities, to gain legitimacy among their own ranks, to show that they're able to cause this sort of damage. It was for internal propaganda purposes and for the sake of carrying on campaign with their other groups and basically testing this new partnership. It wasn't because they thought that they would gain anything other than, a strategic response and political tensions, which was an obvious outcome of such a situation.
Absolutely. So I want to understand, last time when we talked, Irina, look like that Pakistan is not alone. There are some, backroom players here. Do you seriously think there are players who are aiding Pakistan in this sort of, terrorist activities in terms of planning and backing? What is your understanding on this? And are those players also trying to be good to India? What is your understanding on this?
Without a doubt, there's a double dealing going on, and we know that because there's a record going back many years of the so-called Islamist quartet, Pakistan, Turkey, Malaysia, and Qatar, who actually equated the situation in Kashmir to West Bank and Gaza. They consider Kashmir Pakistani territory. Now, Pakistan even dropped this issue more or less in recent years, focusing on other things, but these backers have not. And especially now that Turkey is looking to expand beyond its borders, even as its own economy is in shambles and it's facing internal political instability. Qatar is always looking to make trouble and to invest its money where it was. And they have found some partners in China. Now, how would China benefit from this? It's obvious. Not because they're sympathetic to terrorism, which ultimately is destabilizing to their own investments in Pakistan, but because they're looking to drag India into a war, cause damage, destabilize, and cause investors to flee because at the prospect of a nuclear war. Because let's face it, that's what's on everyone's mind. For some reason, everyone assumes that if there is some trouble between two nuclear powers, there is a higher chance of nuclear war. And in my opinion, it's actually significantly lower. But the fact that there still could be significant military action, that's without a doubt. Uh, but China benefits from it, and we have seen China actually on the ground in Gaza. They were not only selling weapons all over the region, they were Chinese engineers in the Hamas tunnels assisting with those things. Were they on the front lines of planning the operations? Probably not. But were they assisting with political support, with propaganda on TikTok, with structural and logistical support, probably with intelligence, possibly with intelligence inside Israel, penetrating internal networks? That's highly likely. And I think we are facing the same sort of situation. Here, these countries providing support and encouraging a terrorist attack because they're not the ones who have to pay for it. They're not the ones who are going to be held accountable. Pakistan is, so they don't care if they put up a proxy in front. For them, there's only benefit from weakening India and from promoting their ideology and their agenda and their political and geopolitical objectives.
Right. How do you think, Pakistani establishment would be looking at it? India has already done the first round of things, talking in its own way, attacking those nine different sites, if I understand.
Mhm.
And then also very well coordinated action, press conference, and everything from the policy side, government side, diplomacy side, army, navy, air force. Everyone has been a very coordinated action, and clearly mentioning that we have not targeted military installations of Pakistan, but just the terrorist ones. But Pakistan, if I understand, the voices have been that we will retaliate. How do you see that? What are the options here? How do you see this all panning out? Or do you think Pakistan is only making noises? It understands things. It will just keep quiet after that.
If I were Pakistan, I would just try to mend the situation behind the scenes and stop making noise, because it's very easy to get it out of hand. And even if the government has no plans to take any further action, this rhetoric can cause independent actors to get involved on behalf of the government and cause a massive escalation unintentionally, incidentally. I think that's the real risk here. I also don't think Pakistan has the capacity to fight a serious war with India. I think it's a joke. I also think that the foreign minister who spends his days posting memes on social media does not really have a real strategy. And what is the end game for Pakistan here? What would they hope to accomplish? Are they going to go try to conquer Kashmir? That's not going to work. Are they going to try to, to move into Delhi? That's never going to happen. So, what would be the end game for Pakistan retaliating other than inviting further attacks on their own military infrastructure this time? I don't see a real move forward here. I think their best option is actually, if they were to do anything, it would be some sort of hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, warfare in courts, political bickering, and demands for sanctions and retaliations, and noise through propaganda around the world. That's the most they're capable at. Now, if, however, this attack was only a test for something bigger, more planned, if there are cells all over India operating semi-independently and gearing up for further attacks, that could be a completely different ballgame. And that is my concern, could be something in the works, because, this particular incident in itself was devastating, was tragic, was an atrocity, but yet it was, a limited attack, which to me seems like a test. It seems like it's a preparation for something else, to test India's response, to see what happens if this is what we're going to do, which means there could be something more serious in the work. And I think this is time for very serious counterintelligence operation, not even an operation, but effort, multilateral effort to get to the bottom of what the real plan could be.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a very big point that you have made, Arina, and I'm sure a lot of work needs to be done by India. They will be watching it, and perhaps nobody can rest easy if there is a larger plan here. But let's look at the world. The world has reacted in its own way. How do you look at that reaction from the world's anger? And because this time it was an attack on tourists, so many of them died. Nobody will be able to give some kind words of for people who have done this heinous act. So how do you see this whole world reaction towards, mostly people are talking about from India's side?
Yeah, I don't see much sympathy for Pakistan in this scenario. Nobody is defending Pakistan or its actions or its denials or its refusal to take any sort of responsibility for anything. The biggest fear is, of course, escalation and what it could mean from business standpoint, from foreign policy standpoint. US is concerned about the situation getting out of control, another the international flashpoint, another crisis. IMEC corridor, just as the US is starting to gear up for re-engaging on this issue with the Gulf. Here comes another potential security disruption. So people are concerned for good reason, but I also feel like a lot of the leaders are missing the big picture, which is what we just discussed. The fact that there are other players and other agendas. The real threat here is not nuclear warfare, because I don't think anybody wants that. I don't think Pakistan wants that. I don't think India wants that. I don't think China wants that. I don't think anybody actually wants a nuclear war. But what I do think the real risk is potential hybrid warfare escalation that gets out of hand and involves more and more parties from outside the immediate zone of conflict. And I think this is the scenario that nobody's really discussing or looking at it, because the nuclear war is that shiny coin that's being thrown to get people agitated and to start talking about de-escalation, whereas in reality what's needed now is to get to the bottom of how many people are actually involved, understanding the nature of collaboration between the terrorist organizations and who is backing them, and disrupting much bigger networks internally and externally before they strike somewhere else.
Absolutely. Now let's look at specific players here. From the US side, how should we look how do you think the US administration under Trump must be looking at it? Because very recently, the US vice president was here. It happened during that time, and they must be watching it much more closely, especially with lots of talks of India US collaboration, cohesion, and in terms of economic one, especially, and also in the future, maybe, all about if China comes into the picture. How do you think US is watching all these things for beyond the words that they are speaking?
In my opinion, there's a missed opportunity in the US. Not that they've done anything particularly terrible. I can't say that they've had any bad reaction. They called for, there was a call. They condemned the attack. They're trying to avoid a major crisis. But I think what would have been very good gesture is for a high-level official, either President Trump or the vice president, to return to India right after the attack and to make a very powerful gesture of solidarity, just as when Israel was attacked, U.S. heads of state and U.S. leadership went to Israel to show their solidarity. If the U.S. is really pushing hard to elevate the relationship with India, and it's very obvious that that is the case, this would seal the deal and put to rest a lot of the concerns inside India about this administration's intentions based on some of the disagreements that we are seeing and various concerns. So the fact that this hasn't been done, I don't think I think it's a really missed diplomatic opportunity. I think before going to the Middle East, there should have been a planned stop, even a brief one, just to shake hands and do a brief photo op in India. I don't think it's still too late to do that. even as a surprise, either en route there or on the way back. I think that would be a very good idea for someone to organize something like that. So that's in terms of messaging, strategic messaging to all of these bad actors. I think it would be a very powerful signal. In terms of practical deliverables, I think intelligence will continue to cooperate, but I think the fact that right now there is a big re-examination of priorities and a big cut in human intelligence is concerning. I don't think it will necessarily affect all of intelligence. I think there'll still be a lot of very powerful tools that could be valuable assistance. But the fact that there's multiple ongoing crises and this is the time that the administration is choosing to cut human beings who carry on important relationships across the border is deeply concerning. I'm wondering whether our agencies will end up short staffed and unable to deal with the increasing number of crises. And the more something like that is publicized, and misplaced priorities, such as putting some of the intelligence to spy on Greenland where there's literally nothing happening, while there's a major crisis brewing in a very hot area with multiple connections to other regions. I'm wondering whether this administration has its priorities straight when it comes to something like that. I don't mean necessarily that there's any bad will towards India. I think there's a full desire to cooperate as much as possible, but I'm not entirely sure that the people who are running the show have the experience to think strategically in this on these administrative issues and prioritization of resources. So that's my biggest concern, not that they would cooperate and lend any assistance, but that they have not quite planned out the potential threats and what the real threats are versus what are the threats, that the issues that are desirable, that are of interest to the administration, but are not necessarily top security priority. Greenland is a long-term interest because of natural resources, but it's not an emergency. It's not so urgent that it cannot wait when you have a known number of terrorists operating and we don't know where else they're going to go after this.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Another big player, Russia. It has its own friendship with India, own equations, but over the last few years, it also gotten its diplomatic relations with Pakistan has become much more thicker. How do you think Russia is looking at it? Do you think it will be the same with India for Russia, or is it going to be much more different under Putin?
I think it's very obvious that Russia wants to maintain economic and trade interests with India as a country. It's a huge market. It's for a long time has been very dependent on Russia for weapons and for energy needs. And it has many logistical and other advantages that Russia is very happy to take care of. And quite frankly, there are many instances where countries are able to maintain relations with conflicting neighbors without necessarily it causing a direct problem. But in this case, I do think there is a very clear conflict of interest. Because when I just because I think Russia is shifting closer to China. I think it's becoming part of a more integrated network. I think it's increasingly seeing India as a potential US playing field in terms of technology and in terms of investments. And this sort of direction is not up to its taste and it's looking to co opt an area. I think Russia, having blown a lot of its economic resources on wars in Ukraine and other places, is now not looking necessarily to recoup its costs, but it's looking to weaken others as much as possible to level the playing field. And from that point, its role is going to be more of an agent of chaos than a party looking to establish equitable economic cooperation. And so, while from a Western standpoint, for instance, its actions may not appear logical or beneficial to its own interests, because Pakistan is a much smaller player with India, does not have necessarily the same economic opportunities. From Russia's perspective, if it wants to pursue geopolitical goals within its own framework to weaken the West, it makes perfect sense. I also believe that despite its still remaining interest in economic activity with India as a country, it is not necessarily favorable to the party in power currently and to Prime Minister Modi and his nationalist view, because that nationalist view has taken India away from dependence on Russia and towards independence and a more diversified political position, as opposed to be much more in the Russian camp. And I think we are going to see that Russia may look to not undermine India, but to benefit those parties in India that are looking towards more traditional relationships in that regard. And we should judge its actions accordingly. At least India should, if it wants to understand how this relationship is going to play out on the surface. I don't think Russia will act in a hostile public way but behind the scenes there will probably be a lot of activity that benefits some of those other actors and ways to weaken specifically the party in power. That's my assessment.
Right. What about China? Means it does not have to have that. It does not have that dilemma, except for financial interest, economic interest, it relations with. But it knows again that India has its own way of looking at things. India is very open dealing with the West, and China. It has the old problems are still there, though the economic part is still there to be talked about. How do you think China will be walking this particular new world that's unfolding?
Look, it's not just China itself, it's specifically Xi and his policies that have become significantly more aggressive, extreme, and nationalistic, far beyond what we have seen with previous Chinese administrations. So, while on the surface he is willing to make gestures like settle border issues with India or try to advance economic relationships and investments in India, all of these things are entirely self serving. And quite publicly, it's not in China's or Xi's interest to really mend the fences, so to speak, especially with the massive infusion of US technology flowing into India at the moment, and quite the opposite trade war with the United States taking place and US tech companies being exiled, the ones that remained, and all sorts of national security laws being invoked, etc., 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 and India potentially becoming a rival in terms of providing US with the rare earth minerals that the Trump administration can no longer be getting from China directly. All of these things come into play. Do I think China will be publicly engaging in some sort of massive acts of confrontation? Probably not, because right now their priority is elsewhere and they don't need to have a big public fight with India. All they need to do is just tip the scale slightly and cause problems enough that it will give them advantage. If they can do something to disrupt the business climate in India, to make it harder for India to develop economically, that's already a win in their book. They don't need to do anything more. And if they can help other parties that are causing destabilization just enough that it causes investors to take a second look, they are more than happy to do that, I am sure. But they will not be craving the limelight. They don't need to. They have much bigger fish to fry. But weakening India, dragging into wars, distracting it, causing it to weaken relationships with its close allies or partners or counterparts, that's what China wants. And
Right.
it will be playing both sides. It will, on the one hand, try to keep India out of the Western camp as much as possible, but on the other hand, also trying to undermine India behind the scenes in all ways possible.
Absolutely, absolutely undermine India in all ways possible. What about Turkey? Turkey is also, expanding its reach, its voice, and everywhere. Do you think Turkey uh, will play or looks like to be looking at this situation to also, give some sort of a stamp here in its own way, that it exists in whatever way it is?
I think the Turkey's agenda is more complex here because they're not just looking to cause terrorist attacks. I think their agenda for these terrorist attacks is to cause divisions in India and to try to situate themselves and to as a leaders of Muslim world and Muslim communities. So the fact that Prime Minister Modi met with Sheikh Dr. Al Isa in Saudi Arabia was extremely important because it's still MWL is still the leader of the Muslim world, and the message concerning the terrorism, the sovereignty, the Muslim, Hindu, and etc. relations was a very powerful message, which I think will blunt the impact of these efforts very significantly. And the rest, of course, is up to the Indian government to maintain good internal relations and not allow this sort of meddling to occur and to cause problems. But I do think that India is very much that these actors, Turkey, Pakistan, Qatar, all of these guys will on the one hand invest money into India, on the other hand also invest money into all sorts of religious activity, cultural activity, soft power activity, and try to radicalize groups, and more importantly than just radicalization, cause distrust and divisions and suspicion and between communities, and try to cause backlash among the non-Muslim communities, to cause this internal chaos. That is much bigger weapon for them to even try than any sort of act of terrorism, because the distrust that this sort of thing breeds, the sort of rhetoric that can cause, and the suspicion between communities can easily get out of hand, create bad optics, and make the situation worse and much easier to exploit on a bigger scale. So this is what I would be very wary of. These sort of
Absolutely. And
false friends.
absolutely, absolutely, Irina. You have been explaining things very well for a lot of people globally, especially a lot of people in India watching this and trying to understand this whole thing from a global perspective. And also, a lot of international audiences watching it right now. One last player we want to understand about is Israel. Israel has traditionally good relations with India, especially on information sharing and several other fronts. Do you think Israel will look at it as an opportunity to strengthen its ties with the Indian administration, Indian government, especially under Prime Minister Modi? How do you think Israel will be watching it and trying to maximize its understanding with India?
I think we have seen some of it already, because some of the Israel officials came out and basically declared that this is the same problem with the same players and it needs to be tackled jointly. And I think this is what is going to be done. Now, don't get me wrong, Israel is now strained on multiple fronts with domestic tensions, Gaza, Syria, watching what the US administration will do with Iran and with the Gulf states, and all these other things happening at the same time. But I do think that to the extent it's possible to assist, they will provide any and all assistance, because it's in their own interest, because it's now the same game, the same tactics, literally the same actors working jointly, working not only against India or Israel, but against the India-Israel alliance. This is why we're seeing them cooperate and in the future we can see, if these networks are not disrupted in time, we will see more joint actions on both fronts against both of them, involving enemies of both countries. Yeah, so for sure this cooperation needs to be very close, and I think it needs to be continue to go beyond just counterterrorism, counter extremism. There needs to be a much more a continuing growth in people to people relations as well, soft power relations as well, education, counter extremism, media. All of these things need to be closer brought together for people to understand each other's situations and discourse, and to be able to build very strong and unified front on all of society, as we call it, levels, which will make it much more difficult to penetrate.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for this whole deal of this understanding about different players and also how this looks to be panning out. Let's move on from this region to the United States of America. There a lot of happening as usual. When Trump is there, a lot will always happen. And this time, NSA Waltz has been outstated, relegated to the United Nations, and Rubio has got more responsibilities. Is Rubio doing a great job?
I mean, to be honest with you, it's hard to say because, frankly, he doesn't. He has a lot of hats, but he doesn't seem to have a lot of power. Because I think at this point it's very obvious that Witkov seems to be the leading figure on many of the major crises: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, and now, of course, Iran negotiations as well. He's overseeing it, even if he's not involved in every aspect of it. So I'm just wondering why have the Secretary of State at all, and why not just appoint Witkov as the Secretary of State and have Rubio do some specific region or specific issue? But I think, unfortunately, Rubio is not. While he's getting more work, I would call it busy work. It's not necessarily a reflection of greater trust, because all I'm seeing Rubio doing is expressing the top-down direction and not really having a lot of free room to push back against questionable policies. So to me, it doesn't seem like he's in any position to have much influence. He's only in a position to execute and follow direction and to maybe mitigate some of the damaging remarks wherever it's possible.
Absolutely. And on what about this CIA, removing of officers, intelligence officers, especially when you need it against, China. 1,200 CIA intelligence officers are, looking, they are looking to oust them. And the agency is busy getting some Chinese spies for themselves through them. How does this look like? Means, is it playing with fire? Is it, or they are not understanding, or they are very intelligent plans which we do not know about?
Well, I do think they have a plan, but it's intelligent or not, it's not for me to say. But I think the plan is to significantly reduce intelligence as a concept in the United States. There are people appointed to these positions who are skeptical of U.S. use of intelligence. Tulsi Gabbard is one of those people. They think U.S. should be playing a lesser role on the global stage. They think U.S. role in intelligence is dangerous, and they prefer other actors to take the front stage. Russia being one of them. So they're acting in accordance to this vision of reducing American power. Is that, in my opinion, good for U.S. interests? Absolutely not. Nobody wants to be a mini power. Everyone is trying to be a superpower if they can. So the fact that this is what's happening, you can like what U.S. is doing, you can criticize its foreign policy and its aspects of its intelligence, certainly, but nobody in their right mind would advise the U.S. to try to become less powerful and expect US to take it seriously. This is not a normal attitude to have. Of course, people will go in different countries with different interests will complain, but that's just how it is. That's just the nature of the game. So the fact that this is the actual agenda of the administration is actually deeply concerning.
Absolutely. Let's watch out of that, how that pans out. But let's look at the US Ukraine deal and Russia here. Miss, where are we headed? If I understand the deal looks very good on paper, this whole minerals deal. What about the substance part? Everyone says, okay, it's great, but does it actually work on the ground? Secondly, about the Russian part, Miss Russia, US, all these efforts trying to get Russia to the talking table, this looks like to be a problem still unresolved. Is this a failure for the Trump administration? What would you like to? And now they are talking of sanctions against Russia. Means it's very, very confusing. I can tell you, Irina. It's very difficult to understand what to even understand about it.
Well, in terms of Ukraine, the deal does not. On the one hand, it took away the maximalist demands from Trump administration. On the other hand, it does not provide any security guarantees, and it was not approved by the Ukrainian parliament, which means it could be amended or revoked at any point. The good news is that for Ukraine, it doesn't mean much in terms of commitment. Many of the rare earths that we're talking about are located in areas occupied by Russia, so it's not going to be an issue for a long time. What they're getting out of it, however, is US lifting sanctions, allowing Ukraine to buy very sophisticated weapons, and US committing, symbolically recognizing Ukraine's sovereignty by committing to those territories with, you know, practically speaking, where those minerals are located, and on the contrary, denying it to Russia, which had approached the US with the same deal. Concerning Russia, yes, the administration is failing. Russia never wanted a real relationship with the US. They want to get sanctions lifted, they want to get the diplomats and intelligence back in, and they want to get economic concessions, but they don't want a relationship, and they don't want peace with Ukraine or with anybody else. They want to continue their geopolitical agenda. And the sooner the administration realizes it, the better. Right now, they're wasting time, wasting resources, and weakening themselves unilaterally while Russia is hanging on in the hopes of securing a lifeline between all of this.
Right, right. So, what about friendship between Putin and Trump? Is it over, or is it going to take another? Will America go back to back to friends with Europe the same way it was? How does this all look like, Irina?
Well, I think Trump is still instinctively gravitating towards authoritarian types. I do think that his actions against Europe are still quite hostile, and we're talking about the spying on Greenland, the tariff wars that are still unresolved, and general unraveling of structural relationships. I do think some of the rhetoric has softened in recent days, like J.D. Vance this morning at the Munich conference. He at least gave a symbolic nod to the importance of the relationship with Europe. But do I think practically that's going to change anything? No. Too many players are in place who are against all of that and are looking in the other direction. So for the time being, I think it's still going to continue as it is.
Right. What about sanctions? Do you think US is serious about it? They will go for sanctions, or do you think the third round of 90-minute talks are still yet to happen one more time?
I think that US is trying to leverage the optics of deterrence to force Russia to give them at least something and to give a way out. And we don't know whether Trump would even sign those sanctions. I think he likes to threaten a lot. But if he gets even a minimal rhetorical nod, he will immediately abandon the idea and run back to Putin to try to make things work again. And given that he's proceeding with the talks with Iran and wants Russia's assistance, I think that's a very good possibility.
Absolutely, absolutely. And our last topic of the day is Turkey. A lot of actions happening from Turkey, getting deeply involved with in Africa, and even along with China relationship. We have to assess that. How do you look at this whole Turkey deepening relationship in Africa, and a lot of involvement there? Help us understand all this. What is it that Turkey wants to achieve here?
This is not new. This has been going on for literally decades, starting with humanitarian actions, especially in Somalia. But the bottom line, of course, is all about power projection. Turkey is looking to resurrect the Ottoman Empire in the areas like Libya, where it has a stronghold. It basically controls parts of Tunisian government, both the technocrats and Islamist parties. Somalia, Red Sea, strategically important. And Algeria, it's also looking to sell weapons to compete with other countries economically and politically, and it's looking towards building up its own Islamist stronghold all over Africa. Africa is a continent rich in people, in natural resources, geographically important, geopolitically important, and it's going to become even more so in the future. There's a lot of entrepreneurship, but there's also a lot of instability, terrorism, authoritarianism, and Turkey is looking to strengthen itself by going to a place that is largely ignored by the United States, by many others, and to complement China and other countries that it cannot directly compete with, but it can provide other strengths that those other countries lack. So we are going to see even more of Turkey in the near future, and it's not necessarily going to be all beneficial. It's going to have a very strong anti-Western component to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the World According to Irina Shukerman on the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.